watching the Iowa and Iowa State game last weekend, and in many ways, it wasn't exactly surprising in terms of the lack of scoring and just the back and forth. I mean, every single year, it's always one of those games where it's going to come down to the wire. Even last year's game too, it was a 54-yard field goal where Iowa State won the game, and it was essentially the same thing this year too. And I got to tell you, Iowa State looks really good. So big shout out to them and Matt Campbell and what they're doing there. But I think we got to turn our attention to the Iowa Hawkeyes here, and they're always a fascinating team to cover in the sense that they are pretty much the pillar of consistency in terms of always having really solid recruiting, always really strong defensively, really good front seven, disciplined, all those things. And you have a guy like Kirk Ferentz, who, in my opinion, is one of the most underrated, underappreciated coaches in the entire country. It kind of makes you ask yourself, hey, if they just got a couple more weapons offensively, where they can kind of go from here, which leads me to this topic. And, from what we've seen in the past couple of weeks, I mean, I was definitely expecting a little bit more in terms of them offensively, because, I mean, Mark Gronowski, has 49 wins as a college football quarterback. He's definitely going to beat the record all time. I think Kellen Moore has 50. Yeah, don't quote me on that, but I know the record is 50. And, his last games, he played Albany week 1, and then it was Iowa State week 2. And I think all things considered, I mean, he's only had about a handful of yards. I think it was 66 yards in the Iowa State game. So it just kind of makes you think to yourself, where they kind of go from here. And I think the one thing that Gronkowski is doing that definitely kind of adds another layer to this offense is the fact that he's definitely a pretty solid runner. He knows how to use his legs. He knows how to get those touchdowns. He's somebody who's more experienced. And I guess what I'm kind of missing from this Iowa team and from Tim Lester as a play caller is I was just expecting this progression just happen a little bit more naturally. And anybody who's watched Tim Lester call plays, I mean, whether he's at Western Michigan, or any of his other stops, I mean, it's not like a super complicated offense or anything. It's primarily predicated on running the ball, kind of West Coast pro style type of thing. And anybody who is an Iowa Hawkeyes fan knows that, even last year when you had the carousel of quarterbacks from last year, when you talk about Brandon Sullivan, you talk about Cade McNamara, and you kind of sit there and say to yourself, this is the real one piece that we're kind of missing. But there are some more layers to this, right? I would argue that the wide receivers really haven't got much separation at all. I mean, there are definitely some moments where I think, Gronowski was able to extend some plays with his feet and definitely kind of bailed them out and some moments, not only in the Albany game, but also in the Iowa State game. And I think that's kind of where he's kind of trying to find his rhythm a little bit more, because there's times where he's bailing out of the pocket too quickly. And then there are times where he's almost just kind of frozen in the pocket trying to find a read. But in reality, it's a mix of, hey, you're also staying there a little bit too long. But I would also argue his wide receivers have kind of let him down this season. Yes, they brought in some playmakers, a handful of transfers, and you were kind of expecting them to take a little bit of a higher jump. But I would argue, Iowa State, trust me, they're a phenomenal team all around. But I was just expecting a little bit more, especially, when you want to remain competitive in the Big Ten, you just kind of have to be able to utilize that and figure that out. But like I said before, all things considered with Iowa, your running game is always going to be what's ultimately going to be carrying your offense. And the Hawkeyes ran the ball 39 times to 24 pass attempts, and Gronowski had 16 rushes too. So they are kind of trying to do this. I'll almost compare it to Georgia Tech in the sense that, Haynes King is a gritty guy, just somebody who's a natural leader. And, they also have Jamal Haynes too. So I'm almost kind of getting that sort of vibe from them. And, in terms of the Iowa State game too, out of Iowa's 214 total offensive yards, 131 of them came from the ground. So it's definitely a little bit discouraging in that regard, because, when you're sitting there and you're saying, hey, you bring in this quarterback from South Dakota State who had over 2,700 yards in each of his first 3 seasons, and now going into his first 2 games, he only has 130 yards. You're just sitting there saying to yourself, like, what the heck is going on here? And I think there are some deeper issues beyond just Gronowski and the wide receivers um, not getting anything going on too. But I'd say for the most part, I think I was just quite frankly just kind of predictable. To me, it just kind of seems that you know they kind of have this figured out right now, and either whether it's the play calling that has to be spiced up, whether it's just they just have to be a little bit more patient. That's why I think I'm so fascinated by this matchup versus UMass this week, because it pretty much is going to be a tune-up game, considering that UMass did lose to Bryant last week. So I think if you're an Iowa fan, this is really going to be kind of the game where I sit there and say to myself, if I'm an Iowa fan, I really want to see this playbook open up. I'm really kind of curious to see what they kind of have in store, because yes, it is great that they have close to 500 yards rushing in both games, but I think if you really want to be a Hawkeyes team that has a bigger ceiling than 7 or 8 wins, you have to find a way to pass the football. And it's not just defensively or offensively as well. It's also defensively. I mean, even when I watched the Albany game and the Iowa State game last week, I was definitely a little bit discouraged to see the pass rush continue to be a problem. I mean, last year they finished below the top 100 in terms of sacks recorded last season, and they were still 8-5. So you kind of sat there and said to yourself, hey, if they brought in a quarterback, they got a couple pass rushers in there, and they continue to solidify that offensive line. I mean, I would sit there and say that, yeah, eight wins should definitely be kind of a gimme from there. But at the same time, too, there is some optimism here, right? Because it's not like this is the first time we've ever seen Iowa have a slow start. I mean, even if you look at last year, they've always been kind of a team that it takes them a couple games to really get into a rhythm. That's why I think this UMass game is just so paramount to their success moving forward. Because, again, considering that Iowa held a guy like Rocco Beck to only 1 touchdown and 16 points last week, and Rocco Beck is really a guy who I would anticipate going to be in the NFL one day. So for them to be able to figure that out, for able to minimize him, I think it's a really strong defense that you have too, because you do have a lot of key playmakers. I'm a huge fan of cornerback TJ Hall, who had three pass breakups and probably a couple that I would argue probably could have been a touchdown. You have Carson Sherrar, who had 7 tackles last week. So there's definitely a lot of key playmakers for this Iowa Hawkeyes team, and I definitely think they are going to figure it out somehow, because to me, it just seems like one of those programs that always do. But if you're Tim Lester and you're Kirk Ferentz, you're trying to figure out, hey, how do I really get this offense to click? I think you got to find more creative ways to not make it so obvious that Gronowski can get the ball all the time. I think you have to find a way to get Jacob Gill going. I mean, he only had 5 catches last week, and no other receiver had more than 1 pass. So I'm like, you got to spread the love a little bit, get that going, and I predict that Iowa's going to be able to figure this out. But watch for their game versus UMass and really just kind of see how much they open up this playbook and how creative they can be in terms of getting past the 7 or 8 win ceiling that they kind of always seem to be in.